Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started slowly. I see the numbers are still creeping up, so I think people are still making the connection and joining, but we'll get going because we've got a little bit to get through today. First of all, I'd just like to welcome you to the Clean Arctic Alliance's pre-PPR 10 webinar, Reducing Black Carbon Emissions and Other Shipping Impacts on the Arctic. First of all, there's a couple of housekeeping matters I'd just like to bring to your attention. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and we will make it available after today for those that have been unable to join us. And secondly, if you have questions, you can submit them at any point during the webinar. If you could please try and indicate to which speaker your question is directed, that would be helpful. And it can be submitted through the Q&A button or option that should be at the bottom of your screen, hopefully. We will hold questions until the Q&A session. We won't be taking them during the presentations, but you can submit them at any time. We will endeavour to answer all the questions during the Q&A session. But if we run out of time, we will try and do what we can to follow up afterwards as well. So I'm just going to say a few words to get us started, and then I'll introduce our speakers today. In around 10 days' time now, the International Maritime Organization will hold the 10th session of its Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee at the IMO HQ in London. It will be the first full in-person meeting of PPR post the coronavirus pandemic. On the agenda will be a number of climate and marine environmental pollution issues of relevance to the Arctic and therefore of importance to the Clean Arctic Alliance. And in particular, there will be discussion of measures to reduce emissions of black carbon from ships burning fossil fuels, and particularly those emissions that have an impact on the Arctic, which we will be following closely. As we start the webinar today, I would just like to remind ourselves of the words of the UN Secretary General from last year. And I'm just going to quote him. "We are on a fast track to climate disaster. Major cities underwater, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages. The extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. This is not fiction or exaggeration. It is what science tells us from our current energy policies." And that's the end of the quote. Nowhere are these impacts being felt more strongly than in the Arctic. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment report, the 6th of its kind, was published just last month. And it concluded that the likelihood and impact of abrupt and/or irreversible changes in the climate system, including changes triggered when tipping points are reached, increase with further global warming. And as warming levels increase, so do the risks of species extinction or irreversible loss of biodiversity in ecosystems, including forests, coral reefs, and in Arctic regions. While there are different levels of confidence in these statements, there is high confidence in each of the following statements from the 6th assessment report. Delayed mitigation action will further increase global warming, and losses and damages will rise, and human and natural systems will reach adaptation limits. Challenges from delayed adaptation and mitigation actions include the risk of cost escalation, lock-in of infrastructure, stranded assets, and reduced feasibility and effectiveness of adaptation and mitigation options. And thirdly, without rapid, deep, and sustained mitigation and accelerated adaptation actions, losses and damages will continue to increase, including projected adverse impacts in Africa, LDCs, small island developing states, Central and South America, Asia, and the Arctic. And these losses and damages will disproportionately affect the most vulnerable populations. It is the potential of delayed adaptation and mitigation action that concerns the Clean Arctic Alliance. For well over a decade now, the IMO has been discussing action to reduce black carbon emissions from ships which impact the Arctic. Not emissions from ships in the Arctic, but emissions from ships which impact the Arctic. At PPR 10, the report of a correspondence group will be considered. With respect to black carbon, the correspondence group report recommends that a working group be established, and that this should further consider the regulation or otherwise direct control of black carbon emissions from marine diesel engines, alongside other work on the development of draft guidelines on recommendatory goal-based control measures. It also reports that the correspondence group discussed options to develop mandatory requirements for black carbon emissions from marine diesel engines. And while it recognized that this was not supported by all of the participants of the group, it goes on to note that the group did agree that further work should first focus on those measures that can be agreed and implemented now. Some of the participants were concerned that potential black carbon emission thresholds would be needed, and it's also recognized that the geographic scope of any regulation needs clarification. So while it is clear that there are still some issues to be discussed, there are some effective immediate measures now on the table which can start delivering the rapid, deep and sustained mitigation of ships' impact on the Arctic as called for by the UN's IPCC. I'm going to briefly introduce each of the speakers now and the panel as well. And during their presentations, they will provide further detail on these matters. First of all, we're going to hear from Liudmila Osipova from the International Council on Clean Transportation, who will present new data on black carbon emissions from ships operating in and near to the Arctic. We will then have a few words from Andrew Dumbrille, advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, on a proposal to amend the definition of heavy fuel oil, which will be considered by PPR. This proposal will have consequences for the Arctic heavy fuel oil prohibition that was called for by the Clean Arctic Alliance. After the two speakers, we will have the Q&A panel session, and Liudmila and Andrew will be joined by Clean Arctic Alliance's Black Carbon Advisor, Bill Hemmings, and Seas at Risk's Dr. Lucy Gilliam to answer your questions. So I'm going to hand over to you first, Liudmila. You have the floor. Thank you. Liudmila, you're on mute still.
Is it better?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right. Sorry for that. Thank you for introducing me, Sean. So my name is Liudmila. I am a maritime researcher in the International Council on Clean Transportation. And today I'm going to present our latest study on black carbon emissions from the Arctic shipping. I'm going to present the numbers, the most recent numbers from 2021, and going to review what are the main emitters and what kind of time trends do observe in the Arctic. So these are main objective of the presentations, just for you to have a sense what you expected to hear. First, I'm going to present a map showing the black carbon emissions in the Arctic. And then I'm going to present some numbers on different types of ships and fuels that contribute to these emissions in the Arctic. And finally, we're going to look at the changes, time trends in black carbon emissions. What kind of trends did we observe over time since our latest publication was released in 2015. I would like to start with the Arctic definitions just to explain where exactly we did this research. So here on this map, you see this purple color. This purple color shows black carbon density emissions throughout the geographic Arctic. Everything lies at or about 58.95 degrees is considered to be a geographic Arctic. And then also on the same map, you can see this blue line. This is the IMO Arctic waters as defined by the Polar Code. And you also can observe two other colors, two other boundaries, green and red. So the green represents the Arctic as it is defined by the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. And the red line is, this actually was the red line, yeah? And the green line is how it is defined by the Arctic Human Development Report. In this particular study that I'm going to present, we looked at the two Arctic definitions, the geographic Arctic and the IMO Arctic waters. So these are purple color and the blue line. So let's start with the geographic Arctic definition. As I already mentioned, this is how the current, like sort of 2021, the most recent situation looks like in the geographic Arctic. So the color, the more intense color shows the higher density of emissions in the area. We look at the main emitters in this area, and we find out that over 8,500 vessels ship in the Arctic, in the geographic Arctic. And in 2021, they emitted 1.5 kiloton of black carbon. Just to mention that this is excluding shipping in the Baltic Sea, since Baltic Sea is not defined as part of the Arctic. We also look at the different ship types that contribute to these emissions. And we find out that the top three ship types are fishing vessels, oil tankers, and cargo ships. And they account for about a half of the total black carbon emissions. And the fishing vessels are the most common ship class in the fleet. They represent about a quarter of the entire fleet in the Arctic. Moving forward, we also look at which fuel type contributed the most to these emissions. So on the left side, you see this stacked plot showing the proportion of the fuel burned in the Arctic. And as you can see, the geographic Arctic most common fuel types right now is distillate fuel. And residual is just a little bit less than distillate. And then finally, we have just about 1% of LNG. And in the pie chart on the right side shows how much of the black carbon emissions each fuel contribute to. So you see that the distillate, being the most used fuel, represent about 55% of black carbon emissions in the Arctic, while residuals is like around 44%. I also plotted the difference between residuals that coming from ships with no scrubbers and with scrubbers in order to comply with the Solcal Cap. And you see that the ships that are shipping in Arctic have only 5% contributions from the ship with scrubbers. And the most common ship equipped with the scrubbers actually are bulk carriers and oil tankers. So just to have a sense how these ship types and fuels correspond to each other, you see here, this is like a wheel chart showing the top 5 emitters, the top 5 most common ship types that emit black carbon in the Arctic. And you see that, as I mentioned before, fishing vessels are the biggest contributors, and the fuel they use mostly is distillate. And interestingly enough, the second biggest contributor, oil tanker, actually mostly used residuals. So you see absolute numbers of black carbon from each combination. So LNG has the lowest black carbon emission, obviously, but it has other problems. It has a methane emission problems. So even though it has a lowest black carbon emissions portfolio, it actually has other issues like methane slips and that contribute negatively to the climate change. So it's not the most sustainable solution in the long run. Moving forward to the IMO Arctic waters. So here is the geographical Arctic, and just a reminder, it's 8,500, a bit over 8,500 vessels, 1.5 kiloton of black carbon. And the blue line representing the IMO Arctic waters shows it covers only approximately 22% of all vessels shipping in the Arctic and 27% of the total black carbon emissions. So as you can see in absolute numbers, we can compare 2015 and 2021 because we did similar study in the past with the similar emission inventory. So as you can see, from 2015 to 2021, the shipping pattern didn't change that much, but the fuel used in the Arctic and black carbon emissions doubled over time. And actually, you can see this trend throughout all the years that we did emission inventory. So from 2015, 17, 19, and 2021, you see this very clear rise of black carbon emissions from the heavy fuel oil, or also from all fuels. So on the left, you see the data from residuals, and on the right from all type of fuels. So if you take 2015 as a baseline and 2021 as a most recent data, you see that both black carbon from residuals and black carbon from all fuels, it doubled since then. If we compare how black carbon emission changed also in terms of what kind of fuels contribute the most, as you can see, the proportion of residuals, distillates, and LNG is very similar. Yeah, there is a slight growth in using distillates. There is a slight growth in using LNG, but the total proportion of all the fuels are remaining the same, regardless of the global super cup that happened in 2020. However, actually changing from residuals to distillates could bring a very significant effect on reducing the black carbon emissions. Just to sort of demonstrate it, we did this study. We look at the 5 most typical shipping routes in the Arctic using residual fuels. So these are 5 ships. You see the map right now on your screen. There's different routes representing different colors. And these ships that represent different type of sort of common vessel trips. Yeah, there's a bulk carrier that goes to Rotterdam. There is a LNG carrier. There is a cargo ship, cruise liner, and also a container ship, all shipping within the Arctic. And we calculated using looking at the type of engine they used, how much fuel they burned over the trips. We look how much black carbon emission could be reduced if they switch to distillate. So we find out if these ships, all of them, that they switch to distillate, the black carbon emissions from them could be from 50 to 80% of reductions, yeah, depending on the engine type. And this map shows that each ship can immediately reduce its black carbon emissions from 50 to 80%, yeah, if they use distillate fuel. This reduction can be even higher if they go to use LNG, but even though LNG solves the black carbon emissions, as I mentioned before, there are also methane emissions from LNG. So in long term, this is not a climate-friendly solution. Just to take off message from this map is that switch to distillate can bring this immediate relief in black carbon emissions in the Arctic. So just to summarize what I just presented, we find out that over 8,500 ships emitted 1.5 kiloton of black carbon in the geographic Arctic in 2021. We also find out that top black carbon emitters are fishing vessels, oil tankers, and cargo ships, and they contribute 50%, a bit over 50% emissions, and they're coming mainly from burning distillate fuels. While the IMO Arctic waters just cover 22% of all shipping vessels, and they cover 27% of black carbon emissions in the geographic Arctic. And black carbon emission in the IMO Arctic waters has doubled since 2015. And the residual fuels stay the biggest contributor of the black carbon emissions in the IMO Arctic waters. That's all on my side. I'm happy to hear any questions if you have any. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Liudmila. That was very interesting and clearly very valuable as well. I'd just like to say a few words and then we'll move on to our next speaker. The Clean Arctic Alliance has prepared, through its members, submitted 3 papers to PPR for the discussions in the week after next. The first of our papers sets out a pathway to black carbon emissions reductions. The second paper proposes a specific black carbon reduction by amending MARPOL Annex 6 and requiring ships operating in the Arctic or in and near to the Arctic to use distillate fuels. And the third paper addresses the geographic scope of any future black carbon measures, be they recommendatory or mandatory. And I think from the work Liudmila has just presented here, it's clear that in order to reduce the impact of black carbon emissions from shipping, it's going to be necessary for measures to be applied to the whole Arctic and probably beyond the Arctic too. Anyway, I'm now going to hand the floor over to Andrew Dumbrille, who is going to speak about a proposal to expand the definition of heavy fuel oil for the purposes of the risks associated with fuel oil spills. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Sean. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Great. Also, thanks to Liudmila and ICCT for that really informative presentation and updating of the black carbon emissions to 2021. I'm going to try to be brief on a very complicated subject as a layperson. It's complicated, but it is important, we think, at the Clean Arctic Alliance. And it's a proposal which was originally from Iceland and Norway to update or refine the definition of heavy fuel oil. So the papers that are being discussed at PPR are the Norway and Iceland MEPC 78.14.1 and Norway's submission to PPR directly, PPR 10.10.1. And there is an associated paper which Australia has submitted to PPR, PPR 10 Inf 12. I won't go into the Australian paper, but it is complementary, especially to the Norway's PPR 10.10.1. It researches low sulfur fuel oils and their properties and the pour point. So the main issue here is Norway and Iceland are proposing an addition to the heavy fuel oil definition of a pour point. And the pour point is the temperature below which a fuel begins to solidify. And just taking a step back first, looking at the heavy fuel oil ban, which comes into effect July 1st, 2024, the original intention was to build on the Antarctic heavy fuel oil ban and apply it in the Arctic to carriage and use. And the core of that, the reason for that ban is the fuel's persistence in the marine environment. Many years of research pointed to how HFO stuck around in the marine environment, emulsified on the ocean surface, and was persistent and didn't break down like MGO or distillate fuels, which evaporated at a much higher rate. And so the HFO ban is focused on the spill risks to the environment, and the Norway, Iceland, and the Norway research really is focused on spill risks, not necessarily black carbon mitigation or black carbon impacts, although there is an implication, which I'll get to a little later on the black carbon impacts. So what the Norway research is finding is that refineries are tweaking some of the very low sulfur fuel oils and the ultra low sulfur fuel oils to comply with the sulfur cap, and potentially around issues like the HFO ban. So from my understanding of the research and talking to the experts in Norway is fuel additives are being added to HFO in order to bring down the density of the fuel and to which puts the very low sulfur fuel oil outside the definition of HFO. The consequence, though, is that it increases the pour point. And so Norway's proposal is to define a pour point similar to what has been defined in Norwegian waters off of Svalbard, which is -6 degrees Celsius in the winter and 0 degrees in the summer. So the higher the pour point, the higher the temperature for the pour point, the more persistent the fuel. And so what Norway has found is that close to 50% or a little over 50% of the very low sulfur fuel oils that are on the market now would actually fall outside of the definition of HFO and will be allowed to be used to comply with the Arctic HFO ban. Unfortunately, those fuels which fall outside of the HFO definition are just as persistent because of their high pour point and just as impactful to the marine environment and to species and to habitat. So the proposal to add a pour point and to increase the amount of fuels considered to be HFO types of fuels would actually help with dealing with this persistent problem. It would facilitate a cleanup and be a good solution around protecting habitats, which is the original intention of the HFO ban. So for these reasons, the Clean Arctic Alliance is recommending that states and NGOs and observers support Norway's proposal to include a pour point in line with what's around what they have around Svalbard. So just lastly, I think looking at the black carbon implications, it is proposed that if a pour point is included, this will nudge or push operators away from very low sulfur fuel oils to more distillate fuel to comply with the Arctic HFO ban, which is good for black carbon emissions. And as Liudmila just said in her presentation, switching away from HFO to distillate fuels reduces black carbon emissions between 50 and 80%, and that's quite widely known. I think that the last thing that I'll say is on the ultra low sulfur fuel oil, and I think the research is still ongoing around this. It would appear that you can't refine an ultra low sulfur fuel oil with a pour point of 0. So if you have an Arctic ECA, you couldn't use ultra low sulfur fuel oil to comply with that Arctic emission control area. So again, you'd be eliminating some of the more hazardous and toxic fuels from use in the Arctic. I think just looking at my notes here, I think I've tried to very complicated subject. Obviously, as a layperson, tried to from a high level describe some of the implications of adding a pour point. And again, the Clean Arctic Alliance feels that this is a good measure and will help with the implementation of the HFO ban and ensure that a wider range of fuels are included in that definition. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. And clearly some important issues there that need further consideration and which we really must address. We'll move on into the Q&A session now. We've already got a couple of questions. Please, anyone who would like to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen, and we will take them in turn. Could I please just ask both of our speakers, Liudmila and Andrew, along with Bill and Lucy, to turn your cameras on so that we can see the panel members. And we'll get going. I'm going to take actually the second question first, if I may, because I think it's directed to Liudmila. Joseph Timkovsky says, Liudmila, great presentation. How can one reduce black carbon emissions from the ships already running on distillate? And I suspect some of the other panel members might like to come in after you as well and add to this response. So Liudmila, you go ahead, and I think then maybe Lucy and Bill will jump in too.
Thank you for this excellent question, Joseph. Yes, that they can be reduced using the diesel particulate filters. They're supposed to be quite effective. More than 90% of black carbon emission would be reduced with the filtering. The thing is that it's not widely used, not widely applied yet, but it could be.
Lucy, do you want to, Bill, would you like to add to that?
Just to say, to just support what Liudmila said, this technology exists. It actually exists for ships of all sizes. The reason why it's not being deployed is there isn't the incentive to deploy. So where diesel particulate filters are being used, it's where there's more port or local regulations where people are calling for kind of cleaner air and for these devices to be deployed. So, the technology does exist, it is available, it is on the market. So there really is nothing stopping a ship owner that is running on distillates to be able to go that extra step and totally remove black carbon emissions from their exhaust.
Well, I just add that the thing that's stopping, because all such equipment requires some sort of an investment, and what's stopping it is the failure of regulators to take these emissions and the climate problem in the Arctic seriously. Diesel particulate filters have been known for decades. They're widely used in road transport in Europe and North America, and what they need is a regulation to require ships to install them. You need to have distillate fuel first. They will not work on residual fuel because they clog. All this has been known for many years. What's missing now is the incentive, and the incentive will only be there if regulators regulate to require these filters to be fitted on ships which already use distillates, and then also to require ships to move from residual fuels to distillates and then move and install diesel particulates filters. These issues are actually not difficult to understand. For some reason, they seem to be difficult for regulators to do their job, which is to regulate.
Thank you, Lucy and Bill, for those add-ons. We have another question from Fernando Escribano says, shouldn't black carbon emissions be added to CO2 emissions? Would somebody like to jump in and respond to that? If not, I can say a few words. Bill, you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that black carbon emissions in 6 years have doubled is absolutely appalling, and everyone should be shocked about that. But since the black carbon emissions are calculated using emission factors based on CO2 consumption, in essence, we're seeing that both CO2 and black carbon has doubled in the Arctic in 6 years. And if that shouldn't be a call for action from regulators, I really don't know what is.
Thank you. And I know, that there are arguments for integrating black carbon into the measures that are being developed to address CO2 or CO2 equivalent reductions. And we are very supportive of that. But I think we need above that, or over and above that, we need additional regulation of black carbon emissions specifically as well. And I see, Fernando, you've added a follow-up question. Are you aware of the technology developed by Bound for Blue to facilitate and reduce significantly fuel consumption in shipping and thus emissions? Could it also be applicable to black carbon emissions? I'm sure panelists would like to come in on that. I mean, certainly we are aware of Bound for Blue's work. We've talked, in fact, Bound for Blue have spoken at one of our events, or a couple of our events at the IMO in the past.
Well, I would just say that I quite often see emails about such technology being able to reduce fuel consumption. I mean, I think if indeed these technologies do so, then it's the wider audience of all transport fuels used in all modes. If these technologies exist, it's not just a black carbon issue, but in the first instance, it's a technology which should be introduced to all users of fossil fuels.
Thank you. And I know Bound for Blue have developed some wind or use wind systems to reduce consumption as well, and have done a lot of work and presented that work as well at the IMO. Joseph has asked a follow-up question. Would you see more intensive use of scrubbers as a solution for ships running on residuals to reduce black carbon emissions? Who would like to jump in and answer that or respond to that question?
Yeah,
Go on, Liudmila.
I can cover this. I think that, I mean, it can reduce black carbon emission, the using of scrubbers. But the problem is that it's not designed to reduce black carbon emissions. So we don't know how different engine loads and different technical characteristics actually going to perform in terms of black carbon emissions. So if you think about it from point of view of just solution for black carbon emissions, so it's not a solution. The ships with scrubbers, they emit at least 82% more black carbon compared to using distillates, MGO. So using MGO is still a better solution than using residuals and scrubbers. And yeah, and besides that, scrubbers have many other issues, right? That, for example, scrubbers, they increase CO2 emissions compared to using alternative fuels. Scrubbers they create hazard pollutants. They pollute water, but also they create sludge that is a toxic. It's a toxic substance that has to be utilized in a certain way, and there are already warnings in some ports. There's not enough facilities for dealing with the if we talk about the closed loop scrubbers, like it produces quite a bit of sludge by volume. You have to somehow deal with that. So scrubbers, I would say scrubbers create more problems than solutions to any environmental and climate problems, right? So yeah, I wouldn't say that using scrubbers decrease black carbon. Yeah, only if you compare it to using pure H4 with nothing else.
Thank you, Liudmila. And I'd add, and you touched on it as well, creating an ocean pollution problem to resolve an atmospheric pollution problem isn't the way we want or need to go. And we believe that to actually be in contravention of the UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, which doesn't allow one pollution problem to be moved from one medium to another. There are all sorts of problems around acidification with the discharge from scrubbers as well. I'm going to jump Joseph's next question, if I may. We will come back to it, Joseph, but we've got some other questions coming in from other people that I'd like to take if we can. Arnie Finson is asking which Arctic countries have fishing vessels and are causing the black carbon emissions in the Arctic. Iceland says it does not use black carbon in fisheries, but who does?
That's a very good question. Yeah, probably to answer this question, we would have to look at the flag affiliation of the shipping in the Arctic countries, which we did not do for the study.
I remember from some of the 2015 data that was published, it showed that there are high numbers of Russian fishing vessels in the Arctic. They weren't by any means the only nation, though. There were fishing vessels from other nations as well. I just remember that the majority of fishing vessels were from Russia, were Russian flagged. But I think there were quite a wide range of countries, including a number of countries that are not Arctic countries. So that's clearly something that needs to be considered and addressed as well. But we'd need to delve more deeply, it sounds like, to understand what flags are using, what fishing vessels are flagged and using the Arctic at the current time.
Sean, it might be useful to clarify. I mean, you know, if the IMO were to regulate, would any regulations affect these fishing vessels as well?
Are you asking a question or answering?
I'm asking you to perhaps respond to that question because it's related, you know. I mean, if they have to be regulated, who would regulate them?
Well, as far as I'm aware, Annex 6 of MARPOL applies to all ships. So that includes fishing vessels, unless they are excluded. But from memory, I don't think there are any exclusions for fishing vessels in Annex 6, but maybe somebody else knows more and would like to add something on that or correct me if that's wrong. But I'm reasonably certain most of MARPOL is applied to all ships, and then various ships might be exempt for different reasons. But certainly most of the annexes apply to all ships, unlike SOLAS, which applies to ships of certain sizes, cargo ships and cruise ships of certain sizes. MARPOL applies across the board. We'll come back to that one if we can get more information. James Gamble, isn't it also likely that reducing black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping would have a very positive human health effect for Arctic coastal communities? Who would like to jump in there? Andrew, I see you nodding. Would you like to come in?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Maybe I'll lead into it with a couple of, just to remind folks of a couple of different statistics from research. You know, black carbon emitted in the Arctic has 5 times the climate impact as black carbon emitted outside of the Arctic. So ships, you know, transiting Arctic waters or Inuit Nunat waters, you know, have the potential to more severely contribute to ice melt and local warming. And black carbon is 20% of the global shipping's climate pollutants and climate problems. So, you know, getting back to, you know, should black carbon be included in the, you know, revised greenhouse gas targets and emissions reduction, you know, absolutely it should be. And we can see the rise of black carbon in the Arctic context and the potential devastating impacts. So getting to the community impacts, I think a good example here is looking at the recent Canadian initiative around an emission control area. And in that proposal, Canada has has outlined very specifically the human health implications. Black carbon from ships that's emitted closer to Inuit communities will have, impacts on human health and Inuit and Indigenous health, respiratory problems, heart disease. It complicates, underlying medical conditions for communities. And this is one of the rationales for Canada bringing forward their emission control area proposal. Canada is still consulting and engaging on that. I think the last point around Indigenous communities and Arctic communities is, they're some of the most impacted and vulnerable, climate vulnerable communities in the world. And having those communities bear the brunt of further impacts and also economic impacts is really an important piece to this. And the equitable transition is very important. These vulnerable Arctic communities shouldn't be the ones to pay for mitigation measures or fuel switching. So there really needs to be efforts put into equitable transition frameworks and marine equity funding and transition funding to ensure that these Arctic communities are protected and conserved, but don't bear the brunt of these costs. And lastly, in Canada below 60 degrees, for instance, in Canada below 60 degrees, there is an emission control area, and above 60 degrees, there isn't. And so there's an aspect of environmental racism here about a predominantly Indigenous area not having equal protections south of 60 degrees as north of 60 degrees. So there's very compelling reasons to start dealing with black carbon emissions quickly and urgently in order to protect those Arctic communities and Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Some very important points raised there. I'm going to move us on a bit because time's moving on, and I would just want to say thank you to Ilko, who has added further information on scrubbers in the Q&A, and Brian, who has added further information on fishing vessels. Joseph, there's a couple of questions here from you, which I think are both important. One to the panel: how high in percentage terms would you estimate a shipping contribution to the total BC emissions in the Arctic? And then the second one, what would be your top 3 actions to reduce black carbon emissions from shipping on top of switching to distillate fuel? I know, I'll just say something myself on the percentage. I know it's a comparatively low percentage, but it is for many sectors. So it's only around 2 or 3% of the black carbon ending up in the Arctic is coming from shipping. But that's, when you look at all the different sectors responsible for black carbon, there are some that are higher than others, but none of them has a huge percentage. In terms of shipping, I think the issue is exacerbated, though, by the proximity of the ships to the snow and the ice. For many of the other sectors, the black carbon is traveling from further away over longer distances. And so it is settling out, it is causing a problem in the Arctic, and it is being addressed. And in fact, the Arctic Council is on course to have reduced by 25 to 33% black carbon emissions from a wide range of sectors by 2025. But what we're seeing in the shipping sector, as Liudmila has pointed out in her presentation, is increase in black carbon emissions. But there is this problem with the proximity of shipping to the snow and the ice. I'm sure that others that would probably like to add to that. And also there's the question around the top 3 actions to reduce black carbon emissions on top of the switch to distillate fuels. So who would like to jump in first? Andrew, go.
Yeah, just a couple. On an effective HFO ban, which has obviously impacts on black carbon emissions, states not granting waivers or allowing any sort of loopholes in the implementation of the HFO ban, July 1st, 2024 is very important. The ICCT has also done some research looking at, the compliance with the HFO ban and a significant amount of of HFO could still be used if waivers are granted. So not granting those waivers is an important piece of the puzzle too. On the decarbonization, or larger decarbonization issue and the reduction of black carbon, one thing to point out too is LNG isn't the answer, and that's because of its global climate impact, upstream and downstream. In fact, a new coalition was launched last week called Say No to LNG, which is really zeroing in on the climate issues associated with LNG and methane. Methane is a growing, very urgent issue. The Arctic Council is starting to deal with it. The greenhouse gas revision of the strategy should be dealing with it. It's in the shipping industry, it's 80 times more potent climate forcer than CO2, and LNG is mainly methane. So the answer to reducing black carbon isn't LNG. Ambitious targets, ambitious 2030 targets, along with 2040 and 2050 targets will create a culture of innovation within the shipping industry. That's a very important piece of reducing emissions. And if you look at efficiency measures, wind assist, slow steaming, switching to battery propulsion, you can make significant gains in the next 6, 7, or 8 years by putting in place those operational measures, which buys us a bit of time to get to the the next generation of fuels, renewable hydrogen and methanol. So and all those, all the wind assist and efficiency measures will bring down black carbon. So we really need to focus in the short term on some of those measures, which obviously don't include LNG. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Bill, do you want to, or Lucy, do you want to come in on? Bill, you're muted.
Okay, the IMO has been considering this at the request of UNEP and others since 2011, and here we are in 2023 and no action has been taken. I think it's absolutely insane that in an environment like the Arctic, ships are allowed to burn the dirtiest fuel in the business, whether they have a scrubber or not. So the first action is to do what the HFO ban is supposed to do and ban residual fuels from getting anywhere near the Arctic, because it's transboundary emissions that also will be transported into the Arctic. And as Andrew says, they have a 5 times greater impact there. So ban residual fuels, ban scrubbers, that can be done overnight. Because you can switch to distillates overnight, which is the first thing that should be done by all ships. And once you have distillates, then you can start installing diesel particulate filters. They've been in cars and trucks for well over a decade. So why is it that we're still arguing as to whether this is a good solution for shipping when it's been applied in many countries for at least 10 or 15 years? And in parallel to looking at diesel particulate filters, as some countries have already recognized in the IMO, pending whether it's electric power or green fuels or wind power, whether there's a further reduction in the aromatic content of distillate fuels is the way to go, is something which should also be urgently looked at. It's been ignored in aviation. It's been already handled in road fuels. And so once again, you need to ask, what are regulators doing if they're not there to regulate the obvious? And if the Arctic isn't the most sensitive part of the world, the Arctic and Antarctic in terms of climate, then, what is?
Thanks, Bill. We need to start wrapping up in a moment. There's one more question here, Liudmila, that I think you can respond to pretty quickly. And thank you to Steph Meakin, who has provided further information on sources of information on fishing vessels. So thanks for that, Steph. And Liudmila, can you pick up the question from Marnie about cruisers? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. The number of cruises visiting Iceland will reach new record level this year, and partly due to the fact that Russia is closed. Do we know the percentage of cruises burning black carbon? Yes, we know, and it's not very high. Actually, it's just about 3% of the total black carbon emissions. So, like I said, the fishing vessels and oil tankers are the biggest contributor in the geographic Arctic. It's 3%.
Thank you. And any last comments from our panels before we start wrapping up, panelists? Lucy? Sorry, Bill, can I just let Lucy go first? Thank you.
I just wanted to come back to, like, why can't we include black carbon in the equations for CO2 equivalents? And I think that we can, and we should have done when we were developing the EU regulations as part of the Fit for 55 package. We do have the methodology for the emission factors for inclusion of black carbon in equations for CO2 equivalents. So I think that this is, you know, I know it was a question about what are the top 3 actions that we should be doing to address black carbon, but I wanted to add it there that we can in future be including black carbon in equations around, you know, evaluating life cycle emissions, or including in CO2 equivalence factors, in order to make good decisions about which fuels to switch to, and to incentivize the uptake of cleaner fuels. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Go.
Yeah,
Bill, last comment.
Just to add on to that, I mean, the ICCT, Brian, has included some information there on ships by flag. And a lot of those are Russian flagged shipping vessels. But looking at the map of the black carbon intensity, and indeed CO2 intensity in the Arctic that Liudmila showed at the beginning, the real question is, what ships are going up there? Not where they're flagged, but what are they doing? In other words, what is their origin and destination and the purpose of the voyage? And that's the way that universally, not only shipping emissions are attributed, but it's the point of departure and then the point of arrival. And if you look at the map that Liudmila showed, it is pretty clear that a lot of the areas outside the IMO Arctic waters are related to ships going in and out of the Arctic from European and EEA ports. And so I think this map that Liudmila has updated and shown is a wake-up call to many regulators that it's time now to take these issues seriously and look at responsibility for emissions on a departing ports and arriving ports basis.
Yes, I just would like to add to this also that I totally agree that it's also about how ships operate and what do they do in the Arctic. So why do we have such a high emissions from the fishing vessels? This is because there's a highly fuel-intensive activity. And actually, I think the real number of black carbon emissions from the fishing vessels is much higher than we showed, because most fishing vessels are quite small. They're not that big. They maybe don't go to the high seas in the Arctic, but they might very successfully do the job around the coast. So that's probably the number is higher that we presented. And in terms of like, should that be included in the greenhouse gas emissions? We absolutely believe that it should be included. And there are emission factors out there published. We published actually the methodology, how to do that, with very clear explanation, step by step. And I think the first important step that European Union could do is to include, just to start maybe adding black carbon inventories in the MRV system. That would be a really good first step, at least to assess what is the situation. And once it's in MRV, then you can move forwards much easier by including in other policies.
Thank you. I'm going to have to draw the panel to a close now. We're running over time, and I just want to say a few words to finish off today. It certainly seems to me that if we are to achieve the necessary, rapid, deep, sustained mitigation called for in the latest IPCC report, then we're going to need more than guidelines. We need to regulate emissions of black carbon, and we need to do that across the whole Arctic, and probably even beyond the Arctic. and we need to start doing that immediately. The Clean Arctic Alliance is hopeful that PPR 10 will conclude with calling or with recognizing that we need to support black carbon regulation, and we would propose an amendment to MARPOL Annex 6 that would require ships operating in the Arctic to switch to distillate, but that would just be a start. And also, we would like to see PPR support a broader definition of the Arctic to ensure that all black carbon emissions from international shipping that are having an impact on the Arctic are addressed by any measures that are agreed. I would just like to finish by referring back to some of the concluding words from one of the co-chairs of one of the IPCC working groups, the group that was responsible for the report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability that fed into the 6th assessment report. And he said, the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And it's these words that we believe must be held in mind for all future discussions of climate and air pollution within the IMO, including those around black carbon. The Arctic serves as a regulator of global climate and other ecological processes through large-scale patterns related to air and ocean circulation. And the changes that are happening in the Arctic now will have an impact on the rest of the world. We need regulation. We need regulation to set a level playing field, and we need regulation that will drive the rapid and deep sustained cuts that are needed. As I said at the start, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available, and the details will be circulated soon. I've also seen a comment in the Q&A asking if Liudmila's presentation and the figures behind that will be made available, and they will. We'll post them alongside the presentation. So just to wrap up, I'd like to thank our speakers and our panelists, Liudmila, Andrew, Bill, and Lucy. Huge thank you to all of you for your input today. And I'd also just like to thank the participants, or those that are still here, for joining us today. I hope you found the discussion useful, and I hope that many of you will be able to contribute to the discussion at PPR in just over a week's time. Thank you, everyone.